Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're going to dive into a story where Jame and Diep open their very first shop, and within hours, a random chaos turns into a message that feels planned. Who's really behind it? And what happens when Mr. Hoan shows up with a gift that might be a trap? Stay with us until the end. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episode. The morning air is cool when Jame turns the key and unlocks the shop door. No loud music. No grand decorations. Just a simple sign on the glass, shelves stocked with care, and a quiet hope that hard work might finally buy them peace. Diep stands behind the counter, smoothing her apron like she's smoothing her nerves. Nai sits on a small stool near the corner, legs swinging, clutching a warm bun and watching them like she's guarding their dream. Jame checks the cash box, then meets Diep's eyes. "This is ours," he says softly. Diep nods. "First customer?" We greet them together. "Together," Jame repeats, more vow than word. The bell above the door chimes. An elderly neighbor steps in first, curious and smiling. Then another, then two more. It isn't crowded, but it's real. Real footsteps, real eyes on their shelves, real money that could turn into rent and a future. Diep offers samples. Jame helps an older man find what he needs. Nai peeks around the counter, giggling when someone calls her sweet girl. For a moment, it feels normal. Then the bell chimes again, and the air shifts. A man steps inside. Baseball cap pulled low, eyes moving too fast, not browsing at all. Two others drift behind him, closing in like they belong to the same shadow. Jame's spine tightens. Diep's hands freeze. The man doesn't smile. He scans the shop like he's counting weak points. Then, without warning, he kicks the leg of a display table. The table jerks. A glass jar tips and smashes on the floor. The sound slices the room in half. A customer gasps. Nai flinches hard. Diep's arm shoots out to pull her closer. "Sir," Diep begins, polite but firm. The man laughs, loud enough for everyone. "What kind of cheap place is this?" he says. "Everything's ready to fall apart." James steps out from behind the counter. "Please don't touch anything," he says evenly. "Yeah. If there's a problem, we can talk." The man leans closer, crowding James' space. "Talk?" he repeats. "You think you can open here like nothing? Like you're some success story?" One of the men drags a chair across the floor, screeching metal on tile. Another bumps a shelf just enough to make products wobble. It's chaos made of accidents. Customers begin to back away, whispers blooming like smoke. Maybe they have trouble. Better not get involved. Diep feels it in her chest. The reputation she prayed for is bleeding out in real time. She kneels beside Nai and pulls her close. "It's okay," she whispers. "Look at me. You're safe." But Diep's fingers tremble against Nai's shoulder. Jame watches the man in the cap like he's watching a trap tighten. Jame lifts his palm. "Stop. You're scaring people." The man spreads his arms, acting offended. "Scaring them? I'm the one scared," he says louder. "I could trip and sue you in a place like this." Then he turns and accidentally knocks over another display. Boxes tumble. Small items scatter across the floor like spilled patience. The man's eyes flick toward Diep, sharp, deliberate, then back to Jame like he wants Jame to snap. Jame doesn't. He leans in, lowering his voice so only the man can hear. "You made your point," Jame says. "Now leave." The man's smile turns thin. "Not my point," he murmurs back. "Someone else's." James' chest tightens. The man straightens and announces to the room, "This place is bad luck. Who knows what kind of people run it?" He gives Diep one last look, like a blade turned slowly. Then the three men walk out, the bell chiming softly behind them, too gentle for the damage they've done. For a moment, nobody moves. Customers stare at the mess, then at Jame, then at Diep, as if deciding what story they want to carry home. Diep forces a smile that hurts. "I'm sorry," she says quickly. "We'll clean this. Please, please don't worry." But people are already stepping backward. "Maybe we come back another day," someone mutters. One by one they leave. The bell chimes again and again, each sound like a small door closing on their dream. When the shop is empty, the silence is heavy. Jame crouches to pick up scattered items. Diep stands still, staring at the doorway like she can still see those men. Nye tugs Diep's sleeve. "Mom," she whispers, "are we in trouble?" Diep's throat tightens at the word "Mom." She cups Nye's cheeks. "No," she says gently. "Some people just don't like seeing others stand up." Jame's voice is rough, eyes on the broken glass. "And some people pay others to push you down." Diep looks at him, and the truth sits between them without needing a name. Mr. Hoan. That night, the shop closes early. Jame tries to act normal. Locks up, counts the money that barely covers costs, tells himself it's only one day. But he can't forget the neighbors' faces. Doubt spreads faster than truth. At home, Diep reads Ni, a bedtime story with a voice too soft, as if loud words might invite more trouble. When the house finally quiets, Jame still can't sleep. He sits on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands, hands that once signed deals, hands that could move money with ease. Now those hands couldn't stop three strangers from turning their first day into a warning. Sometime after midnight, a faint sound cuts through the quiet. A scrape, then another, like something dragged across glass. Jame sits up, heart thudding. He moves carefully, not waking Diep or Nye, and heads to the front. By the time he reaches the door and looks out, the street is dark and empty. But the feeling remains, like eyes that slipped away a second before he looked. The next morning they walk toward the shop together. Nye holds Diep's hand tighter than usual. Diep's steps are slow, as if she already knows what she'll see. Then the shop comes into view. The glass door is smeared with thick paint, messy, loud, meant to be noticed. A piece of paper is taped at the center. Not long, not dramatic, just a few words in block letters. "Know your place!" Diep stops so abruptly Ni bumps into her leg. Diep's mouth opens, but no sound comes out. James stares at the paint, then at the note. His face hardens, but his eyes flicker. Anger, shame, and that sick feeling of being watched. Nye whispers, "Is it for us?" Jame bends down to her height. "No," he says gently. "It's for people who are scared of us." Across the street, a curtain twitches. A door opens. A neighbor freezes at the sight of the painted glass, then turns away without a word. Diep can almost hear the gossip forming, fast, hungry, unfair. And then they hear another sound, a car door closing. Diep turns. Mrs. Huyen is walking toward them with a small bag of cleaning supplies in her hand, face set with determination. No bodyguards, no luxury car, just her, and a look that says she didn't come to ask permission. "Mom?" James starts, stunned. Mrs. Huyen doesn't answer right away. She studies the paint, the note, the watching windows. Then she looks at Diep, straight into her. No blame, no hesitation, only quiet fury aimed at whoever thought shame would make them obedient. Mrs. Huyen steps closer and touches Diep's arm. "You're not going to bow your head," she says softly. "Do you hear me?" Diep's lips tremble. I didn't do anything." Mrs. Huyen nods. "I know." Then she pulls Diep into a hug, firm, protective, unapologetic. Diep's tears finally fall. "I'm sorry," Diep chokes. "I'm sorry I caused chaos in your family." Mrs. Huyen holds her tighter. "Don't be ashamed of being treated unfairly," she says. "Shame belongs to the people who do it." Jame stands frozen, throat tight. His father expected isolation. He expected Diep to feel abandoned, expected Jame to feel torn. But Mrs. Huyen just showed up like a wall. She turns toward the door and takes out a cloth. "Come," she says simply. "We clean." They work without making a show of it. Mrs. Huyen scrubs paint with slow, stubborn strokes. Diep wipes the edges, hands shaking but steadying with each pass. Jame peels off the note, folds it carefully, and slips it into his pocket like evidence. Nye sits on the curb with a juice box, watching them like she's watching something sacred. Neighbors pass by. Some stop, some whisper, but the whispers sound unsure now, because gossip doesn't know what to do when a powerful woman chooses the side of the shamed. Diep finally asks, voice small, "Why are you doing this?" Mrs. Huyen doesn't look up. "Because someone wants you to believe you're alone," she says. "And you're not." Diep swallows hard. James' eyes burn. This wasn't just about paint. This was about dignity. And his mother is rebuilding it with water, cloth, and courage. Late afternoon brings a different kind of danger. The door is cleaner now, though streaks remain. The street has calmed. For a moment, it almost feels like the storm passed. Then a sleek car pulls up. James' stomach drops. Mr. Huyen steps out, perfectly dressed, posture calm, face polite like he's here to help, like a man arriving to rescue them from embarrassment. Mrs. Huyen's shoulders stiffen. Diep's hands go cold. Knee presses closer to Diep. Mr. Huyen approaches with that controlled smile. "My son," he says warmly. Jame doesn't answer. Mr. Huyen's gaze slides to Diep. "Diep," he says politely. Then he lifts his hand. Keys. He holds them out like a gift. "I heard what happened," Mr. Huyen says smoothly. "Unfortunate. This area is complicated." James' jaw tightens. "I have a better location," Mr. Huyen continues. "Safer, more customers, better reputation. You don't need to fight the neighborhood for acceptance." The keys catch the light. "A fresh start," he says gently. "Take these." For a second, the offer hangs in the air like temptation. It would solve things fast. No more gossip, no more paint, no more fear. But Jame hears the real price. "Take my keys, and you take my control." Diep stares at the keys and feels her stomach twist. She knows traps that dress themselves as kindness. Jame looks at his father. "Why?" he asks quietly. Mr. Huyen's smile stays neat. "Because you're my son, and I don't want you embarrassed by stubborn choices." The insult is soft, but it lands. Mrs. Huyen steps forward and positions herself between Mr. Huyen and the shop entrance, like a gate. Mr. Huyen's eyes flick to her. "Huyen," he says, still polite. "Let me talk to them." Mrs. Huyen doesn't move. "No," she says. Mr. Huyen's smile tightens. You're making this harder than it needs to be." Mrs. Huyen's voice is calm and sharp. "This is not kindness," she says. "This is a leash." Mr. Huyen exhales a quiet laugh. "You always think the worst." Mrs. Huyen lifts her chin. "And you always dress the worst things in clean clothes." Jame feels the old pressure rise. Filial duty, the instinct to keep peace, the fear of what comes after refusal. Then he looks at Diep's face. He looks at Nie's small fingers gripping Diep's sleeve. He looks at his mother standing like a shield. Something in him shifts, deep and final. James steps beside Mrs. Huyen. He doesn't touch the keys. He just speaks, soft but clear. "No," James says. Mr. Huan's eyes narrow slightly. Think carefully. Pride is expensive. Jame nods once. I know, he says. That's why I'm not buying what you're selling. Mr. Huan's mask flickers for a heartbeat, then returns. Mrs. Huyen's voice is firm. Leave. Mr. Huan looks from Huyen to Jame to Diep. He steps back, keys still in hand, smile thin. As you wish, he says, and turns toward his car. Before he gets in, he pauses and looks back, voice calm, almost gentle. This is only the beginning, Mr. Huan says. Then he drives away. The street goes quiet. Diep exhales like she's been holding her breath for days. Nye whispers, "He's gone." Jame watches the car disappear, face steady but heart pounding because he knows the truth. His father didn't come to rescue them. He came to make sure they understood who controls the map. Mrs. Huyen's voice is low. He wanted you indebted. Jame nods. And now, he knows I won't be. Diep's eyes are wet but strong. What do we do now? Jame looks at the shop door. Still imperfect, still theirs. He touches the folded note in his pocket like it's a reminder of what they're up against. Then he looks at Diep. We stay, he says. We build. We protect Nye. We don't kneel. Mrs. Huyen steps closer, hand resting on his shoulder. And we prepare, she adds. Jame nods again, and as the sun sinks behind the quiet street, the feeling is clear. This isn't just about a shop anymore. It's about a family, a choice, a war dressed as help. And Jame knows, deep in his bones, that refusing the keys wasn't the end. It was the moment the battle truly began.
Jame và Diep mở tiệm nhỏ để tự lập. Ngày khai trương, ba kẻ lạ mặt xông vào gây rối, đá đổ bàn, kéo lê ghế, làm vỡ đồ và la lối ôi nhọ, khiến khách hàng hoảng sợ bỏ đi. Chỉ vài giờ, tin đồn đã lan khắp xóm, danh tiếng tiệm tổn hại nặng. Đêm đó, cửa kính bị bôi sơn và dán tờ Now Your Play như một lời nhắc phải cúi đầu. Sáng hôm sau, Diep và Jame lặng người như run rẩy bám mẹ. Huyền đến giúp lau dọn, ôm Diep và nói đừng xấu hổ vì bị đối xử bất công. Khi Mr. Hoàng xuất hiện, lịch sự đưa chìa khóa địa điểm mới để giúp Mr. Huyền chắn cửa, còn Jame thẳng thừng từ chối, hiểu rằng cuộc chiến chỉ vừa mới bắt đầu.